Greetings, friends. The title for this session is Joseph, the Spiritual Director, and it may be helpful for you to read Genesis chapter 42 in preparation for this. While Joseph became great in Egypt, we find his father Jacob in a funk back in Canaan land. By his gruff way with his sons, we see that nothing had changed over the past 20 years. The famine had become serious, and he told his sons, "Why do you keep looking at one another? Go to Egypt and get some food." The glaring fact that he did not send them with Benjamin, Rachel's son and Joseph's full brother, suggests that he was grasping onto Benjamin in favoritism as he had with Joseph. Be this as it may, it so happened that Joseph saw his brothers. Immediately, by the spontaneous instinct that belongs to the wise, Joseph begins a course of events that will flower into a drama of world renown. The word for recognize above also has another nuance to it in the Hebrew, which means to plot. Joseph, upon recognizing his brothers, plotted against them, treating them harshly as strangers. This also brings us back to the murky past, when his brothers saw Joseph from afar and plotted to kill him. Joseph sets in motion a drama that will reenact the past before their eyes. What transpires is crafted by the storyteller in a most exquisite form. Observe the chiastic structure. A chiasm is a series of sections on two panels that mirror one another with a middle section that is emphasized. The one panel you see here is A, B, and C. The second panel is C prime, B prime, and A prime. We have already commented upon Joseph's initial response when he encounters his brother in section A. By a remarkable display of wit, he accuses his brothers of being spies rather than blubbering something out in surprise. This is the B section. This, of course, is a preposterous accusation, but had a remarkable effect on his brothers. Some say that Joseph was being cruel here, but in fact, he was showing brilliant spiritual insight. He instinctively and purposefully begins the process of spiritual direction. As mentioned above, he does this by setting into motion a complex recreation of the past so as to create an atmosphere in which he could test his brothers' hearts. By unjustly accusing his brothers, he was placing them in a similar situation when he himself was unjustly accused by Potiphar's wife. The C sections are of immediate interest. At first, he creates a test to prove their honesty by threatening to throw all but one of them in prison. Perhaps he was curious as to whom he would pick, or they would pick, to go back in Canaan, and how they would come by this decision. Be this as it may, the focus now shifts to his full brother Benjamin. He must come to Egypt to vindicate their story. After forcing them to endure 3 days in prison stewing over these things, Joseph gathers them together and changes the rules of the game. Now only one of the brothers must stay and the others must go to get Benjamin. This is section C prime. Now the reader of this story must pause here to ask a question. What sort of tests were these if Joseph knew full well they were telling the truth? With deft skill, Joseph was testing the hearts not only of his brothers, but of his father as well. As for the brothers, the test would be over how they felt about Benjamin, Joseph's full brother and father's favorite. Would they show concern for him, or would they show bitterness over the inconvenience his absence created, especially since he was safely coddled in his father's protective arms back home? Moreover, how would they respond to seeing one of their brethren bound before them and thrown into prison? Will they leave him in a lurch like they left Joseph many years before? No doubt Simeon was chosen because he most probably was the ringleader in the plot against Joseph. For we know that Reuben, the firstborn, and Judah, the fourthborn, were reluctant to kill Joseph. Simeon was the secondborn, and Levi the third, and we know that they were both violent. Be this as it may, it could not be missed by the brothers that they saw this scene played out before when they bound Joseph and abandoned him in the pit. This déjà vu was meant to jog their memory, or at least free it from years of sinful neglect, so they could have another chance to respond in a more positive way. They must once more go before their father minus a son and explain the situation. They would not have missed the connection. Joseph was also testing the heart of his father. He knew how Jacob created chaos in the family by his favoritism toward him. He suspected that Benjamin would have taken his place, a suspicion that was verified by his absence. Would his father now give up his last remaining link to his beloved wife Rachel, his idol, for one of Leah's sons? There was no assurance that Jacob would take that chance. No doubt Simeon felt this hesitation many times over in his prison cell. He might have been in a more enviable position than his brothers, however, and that he did not have to go back and face his father like they had to. We must not miss the center of this episode, and therefore the core truth the storyteller wishes to convey. Sandwiched in between the two tests, that's sections C and C prime, is the dungeon. Here Joseph shows his astute understanding of human nature. He knew that he had come to self-knowledge through the dungeon. Dark dungeons, in some paradoxical way, can become places of light. Here the brothers had an opportunity to see themselves as they really were. Indeed, their discussion points to the fact that their dungeon was producing the desired effect. This is in B prime. For the first time in 20 years, they actually acknowledged their guilt to one another. Joseph knew that he could never elicit such a confession from them himself. They had to come by this on their own. He only provided the atmosphere by which they could come to their self-understanding. Another way of saying this is that we cannot be told. We must all come to the truth about ourselves by ourselves. For instance, when David committed his sin and lived in the dark about himself for a whole year, the prophet Nathan didn't come up to him and say, "O king, you are an adulterer and a murderer." He lost his head. Rather, he tells the parable of the rich man who stole the only lamb of a poor man. When the king became indignant and pronounced his judgment, it was then that Nathan said to him, "You are the man." Nathan, like Joseph, created a place where David could come to the truth about himself by himself. Joseph came to the truth about himself alone in his dungeon, and so his brother had to come to the truth about themselves in their dungeon. And you have to come to the truth about yourself by yourself. Upon this evidence of his brother's confession, Joseph must turn away from them so that he can weep unobserved. This is the A' section. This is the crucial point which begins his last stage of spiritual perfection. Up to this point, there's a place in his soul that was dark to his introspective probing, a space in which he could not penetrate. It had to do with his past, which up to this point he could not understand, let alone come to terms with. Upon seeing his brothers acknowledge their guilt, there opened up a whole new set of relational possibilities for himself and his family. His weeping is his moment of relief. It is not that Joseph was harboring hateful vengeance up to this moment, or else he would have dealt differently with them from the start. Rather, it was that Joseph now had the opportunity for reconciliation, not only with his brothers, but also with his own uncertainties over self-identification. He was Joseph, the son of Jacob and the child of promise. He could now not only get beyond the pain of the past, but also embrace the past with all its pain. The way is now open for him to ascend to a higher spiritual plane, or, if you will, the next step up Jacob's ladder, that of nurturing others in the ways of spirituality. This act of forgiveness was the grand moment in Joseph's life. To consider this a magnanimous act of condescension toward his brothers, however, or something that emoted out of the goodness of his heart, would be to miss the point completely. This act of forgiveness was his supreme death act. For true forgiveness is a death to one's own sense of self-righteousness. Indeed, forgiveness is the ultimate act of humility. It not only acknowledges the wrongs done to the self, but also acknowledges one's own guilt and accepts one's solidarity with other sinners, especially those who sin against us. We expect to see before us a great Egyptian potentate who had every right to carry out justice against his brothers. In reality, we have a sinner who looked eye to eye with his brothers as an equal, which in fact he was, and say, "I forgive you." Joseph could only do this because he was enlightened about his true nature in the darkness of his own prison. Forgiveness is the offspring of humility. Unforgiveness, or forgiving one out of one's goodwill, is the creature of pride. Joseph, however, cannot afford to be open with his love surging in his soul. Only the possibility of reconciliation exists. It had yet to be realized. Taking on the role of a spiritual director, he instinctively understood that his brothers were only at the edges of self-realization or self-awareness. He therefore sends the 10 brothers home with their silver mysteriously hidden in their sacks. This, of course, was to recreate the horror in his brothers that he himself felt when his garment was found in the hands of Potiphar's wife. How they will respond to being falsely accused with the evidence in their hands of their guilt. Will the silver jog their memories about a transaction made years ago when they sold their brother to Egypt? They must again return home with silver minus a brother. God bless you as you ponder these things.